Hello, and welcome to today's story. My name is Josh, and I took over the narration from Philip. If you have an interesting story you want me to cover, let me know in the comments. I always read all comments. For now, let's get into today's video, where we have a few terrifying stories to share. One of them is this story. The first time Chen Wei heard his name called from the speakers at Binyang station, he was certain someone was playing a recording from decades past. But the second time it happened, 3 nights later, he woke to find dust settling on his pillow and footprints circling his bed in a pattern too deliberate to ignore. The prints were small, military issue, from boots that hadn't been manufactured since the war, and they led from his bedroom door to the foot of his bed and back again, over and over, as though someone had been pacing while he slept. Chen Wei lived alone in a narrow apartment above a noodle shop in Nanning, and he had no explanation for what he was seeing, only the growing certainty that something had followed him home from the old station near Kunlun Pass. Chen Wei was a railway historian, 34 years old, methodical in his work and careful in his habits. He had been researching the abandoned stations along the Guangxi rail corridor for a documentary project, recording oral histories from retired workers and photographing the decaying infrastructure that had once been vital to wartime logistics. Binyang Station had been on his list for months, a remote stop that had been decommissioned in the early 1950s and left to rot among the forested hills. Local guides refused to take him there, citing superstitions he had dismissed as folklore meant to discourage trespassers. He had gone alone on a humid afternoon in late September, driving a rented motorbike along a dirt access road that had nearly disappeared beneath overgrown vegetation. The station itself was a low concrete structure with a sagging tile roof, its platform cracked and sprouting weeds, its waiting room filled with broken furniture and bird nests. The air smelled of mildew and old wood, and the silence was so complete that Chen Wei could hear his own heartbeat as he set up his camera equipment. He spent 2 hours documenting the site, taking notes on the faded paint and rusted fixtures, trying to imagine what the place had looked like when trains still stopped there. It was only as the sun began to set that he noticed the speaker mounted on a post at the far end of the platform, its metal grill corroded but still intact, and he wondered if it might still be connected to some forgotten power source. He had touched it briefly, running his fingers over the pitted surface, and then he had packed his equipment and left, thinking nothing more of it until the dreams began. That first night, Chen Wei dreamed he was standing on the platform at Binyang Station under a sky that was too dark, starless, and oppressive, and in the dream, he could hear the faint crackle of a speaker coming to life, static building into a rhythmic pulse. A voice emerged from the static, male and distorted, reading a list of names in Mandarin with the formal cadence of a wartime announcement. Chen Wei could not make out most of the names, but he heard his own spoken clearly twice, once near the beginning of the list and once near the end, and each time the voice paused as though waiting for a response. He woke sweating, disoriented, and found himself standing in his living room with no memory of getting out of bed. The clock on the wall read 3:17 in the morning. He told himself it was just a nightmare brought on by spending too much time in eerie locations. But the unease lingered, a prickling sensation at the back of his neck that refused to fade. The next day, he continued his research as usual, interviewing a retired railway worker in a tea house and reviewing archival documents at the local library. He felt tired but functional, attributing his fatigue to poor sleep, and he made plans to visit another abandoned station the following week. That night, he slept deeply and without incident, and by morning he had nearly forgotten the dream. It was on the third night that everything changed. Chen Wei woke at 3:17 again, this time to the sound of his apartment door clicking shut, though he knew he had locked it before going to bed. He sat up slowly, his heart hammering, and reached for the lamp on his nightstand. The light revealed his bedroom exactly as he had left it, his clothes folded on the chair, his research notes stacked on the desk. But the air felt different, heavier, and there was a smell he could not immediately place, something damp and metallic. He got out of bed and walked to the door, checking the lock and finding it still engaged. The hallway outside was silent, no footsteps on the stairs, no voices from neighboring apartments. He returned to his room and was about to climb back into bed when he saw the dust. It was everywhere, a fine gray powder coating his pillow and blanket, and when he touched it, he found it gritty and cold, like the dust that accumulates in long abandoned buildings. He stripped the bedding and examined the floor, and that was when he saw the footprints. They began just inside the doorway and circled the bed in a loop, each print distinct and evenly spaced, the tread pattern unmistakably military. Chen Wei counted 11 circuits before the prints stopped abruptly beside the bed, as though whoever had made them had simply vanished. He stood frozen, his mind racing through explanations that all felt inadequate. He checked the windows and found them locked. He searched the apartment and found nothing out of place. He called the building manager and asked if anyone had been in his unit during the day, and the manager assured him no one had. Chen Wei spent the rest of the night sitting in his living room with the lights on, too afraid to return to the bedroom, and when dawn finally came, he felt no relief, only a deepening dread that something irreversible had begun. The footprints appeared again the next night, and the night after that, always at 3:17, always in the same pattern. Chen Wei tried sleeping with the lights on, tried staying awake, tried leaving the apartment altogether and spending the night in a cheap hotel across town, but it made no difference. No matter where he was, he woke at 3:17 to find dust in his hair and the sensation of being watched, and when he returned to his apartment, the footprints were always there, fresh and undisturbed, as though whoever made them was waiting for him. He began to lose weight, his appetite disappearing along with his ability to focus. His colleagues noticed the change and asked if he was sick, and he lied and said he was fine, because how could he explain what was happening without sounding insane? He stopped working on the documentary, stopped answering his phone, and spent his days researching the history of Binyang Station with an obsessive intensity that bordered on panic. He needed to understand what he had triggered, what invisible boundary he had crossed. The station had been operational from 1938 to 1952, a minor stop on a line that had been built to facilitate wartime evacuations and supply transport. Chen Wei found records of several incidents, minor derailments, and equipment failures, but nothing that suggested a tragedy significant enough to spawn the kind of haunting he was experiencing. It was only when he discovered a fragmentary report in a military archive that he began to piece together the truth. The report was dated April 1945 and described an evacuation order issued for civilians living near Kunlun Pass due to advancing Japanese forces. The evacuees had been directed to assemble at Binyang Station, where trains would transport them to safety further south. The report listed 237 names, mostly women, children, and elderly men, all of whom had arrived at the station as instructed. But the trains never came. Communication lines had been severed, and the evacuation order had been issued prematurely based on faulty intelligence. The evacuees waited on the platform for 3 days and nights, exposed to rain and cold, with no food or shelter. By the time military personnel arrived to redirect them, 17 people had died from exposure and illness, and many others were too weak to walk. The bodies had been buried in a mass grave near the station, unmarked and unrecorded, because the military had wanted to avoid drawing attention to the logistical failure. The report mentioned that an officer had stayed behind at the station to maintain a lookout in case the trains did eventually arrive, and that he had been found dead a week later, still standing on the platform, his lantern raised. The cause of death was listed as exposure, but there were notes in the margin suggesting something else: a deterioration of mental state, a refusal to leave his post even when ordered. His name was Zhao Liang, and he had been 26 years old. Chen Wei stared at the name for a long time, trying to imagine what it had been like to stand alone in that place, calling for help that never came, and he understood with cold certainty that Zhao Liang was still there, still waiting, still calling the names of the dead. On the 7th night, Chen Wei woke to the sound of a train whistle, distant and mournful, and he knew without looking at the clock that it was 3:17. The whistle came again, closer this time, and he could hear the rhythmic clatter of wheels on rails, a sound that made no sense because there were no active tracks near his apartment. He got out of bed and walked to the window, pulling back the curtain to look out at the empty street below. The sound of the train was all around him now, filling the room, and he could smell coal smoke and wet metal, the scent of a station in operation. He turned and saw the footprints glowing faintly in the dark, each one pulsing with a dim phosphorescent light, and he realized they were leading him somewhere, not circling anymore, but forming a path toward the door. Chen Wei followed them without thinking, moving through his apartment in a trance, down the stairs and out into the night. The air outside was cold and damp, and the street was deserted, but he could still hear the train, and he could see a figure standing at the end of the block, silhouetted against the glow of a street lamp. The figure was holding a lantern, and it was signaling to him. A slow, deliberate motion that Chen Wei understood instinctively. He began to walk toward it, his bare feet silent on the pavement, and as he drew closer, he saw that the figure was wearing a railway officer's uniform, the fabric soaked and clinging to a skeletal frame. The face was pale and gaunt, the eyes sunken but aware, and when the figure spoke, its voice was the same one Chen Wei had heard in his dreams, mechanical and distant, reading names from a list that would never end. Chen Wei tried to turn back, but found he could not move, could not even breathe, and the last thing he saw before the world went black was the lantern swinging in a slow arc, calling him home. Chen Wei was found 3 days later by a neighbor who had noticed the smell. He was sitting on the floor of his apartment, his back against the wall, his eyes open and staring at nothing. The coroner could find no cause of death, no signs of trauma or illness, only a body that had simply stopped functioning. The apartment was covered in dust, thick and undisturbed, and there were footprints everywhere, layered upon each other in patterns that made no sense, as though dozens of people had walked through the space while Chen Wei sat and watched. His research notes were scattered across the floor, and on the final page he had written a single sentence, over and over until the pen had torn through the paper. It read, "I heard my name twice. The local authorities closed the case as an unexplained death, possibly a heart defect or undiagnosed condition, and Chen Wei's belongings were packed up and sent to his family in Guangzhou. Binyang station remains abandoned, slowly crumbling into the forest, and travelers passing through the area still report hearing a train whistle in the night and the sound of names being called from speakers that no longer have power. I hope you enjoyed these stories. Tomorrow we will be uploading another terrifying story. Feel free to subscribe and put on your notifications to never miss another scary video. I upload almost every day. Wish you all the best, but as chilling as that story was, it is far from the only one. In another part of Asia, something equally disturbing took place, though this time the horror came not from the land, but from the sea itself. Off the coast of Singapore, where the waters run dark and deep between scattered islands, fishermen have learned to avoid certain places after sunset, places where the mangroves grow thick and the tide brings strange sounds carried on the wind. What happened there is a reminder that some voices should never be answered, no matter how familiar they sound, because the sea keeps its secrets, and those who disturb them rarely escape unscathed. Lim Hock was 39 years old and had been diving the waters around Pulau Hantu Besar for nearly 2 decades when he first heard his name called from beneath the waves, a sound so clear and distinct that he was certain another diver was trying to get his attention. But when he turned toward the source, he saw only darkness and the slow drifting of disturbed sediment where something had just passed. He surfaced quickly, breaking through into the late afternoon heat, and pulled the regulator from his mouth, gasping and scanning the water for any sign of his dive partner. The surface was calm, the small boat anchored 50 meters away, and his partner, Raj, was still on board, checking equipment and paying no attention to the water. Lim Hock called out, asking if Raj had been in the water, and Raj shook his head, confused by the question. Lim Hock said nothing more, But as he climbed back into the boat, he felt a prickling unease that had nothing to do with the cold or the exertion, and he could not shake the memory of that voice, so familiar and intimate, speaking his name as though it had known him all his life. Lim Hock had grown up in Singapore's coastal villages, the son of a fisherman and the grandson of a fisherman, and he had spent his childhood learning to read the tides and respect the water. He knew the local superstitions, the stories about Pulau Hantu Besar and its sister island, places said to be haunted by the spirits of two warriors who had fought and killed each other in a legendary duel. The name itself meant Ghost Island, and old-timers claimed the waters there were cursed, that divers who went down too deep or stayed too long sometimes came back changed. Speaking of things they had seen in the murk, shapes that moved too deliberately to be fish and too slowly to be human. Lim Hock had always dismissed these stories as the kind of exaggerations that fishermen told to scare tourists and explain away accidents caused by carelessness. He was a professional diver, trained and certified, and he approached the water with a pragmatism that left little room for superstition. He worked for a marine salvage company, recovering equipment and inspecting underwater infrastructure, and he had made hundreds of dives around Pulau Hantu Besar without incident. The waters there were murky and difficult, the visibility often reduced to less than 2 meters, but he had learned to navigate by feel and instinct, and he trusted his skills. What he did not trust, after that afternoon, was the silence beneath the surface. The way it seemed to press against his eardrums and make him hyper-aware of every small sound, every shift in current, as though the water itself was listening. That night, Lim Hock dreamed he was underwater, suspended in a void where light could not penetrate and sound traveled in slow, distorted waves. He was searching for something, though he could not remember what, and as he swam deeper, he became aware of a presence moving parallel to him, just beyond the edge of his vision. He tried to turn toward it, but his body would not respond, and he could only drift forward as the presence drew closer, until he felt it brush against him, cold and slick, and covered in something that tangled around his arms like wet fabric. A voice spoke his name, and this time he recognized it, though the recognition brought no comfort, only a deep, visceral terror that jerked him awake. He sat up in bed, breathing hard, his skin damp with sweat, and he could still feel the phantom touch of whatever had reached for him in the dream, a sensation that lingered long after the images had faded. His wife, Aileen, stirred beside him and asked if he was all right, and he told her he had eaten something that disagreed with him, a lie that felt easier than trying to explain a nightmare. She went back to sleep, and he lay awake until dawn, listening to the sound of distant traffic and the hum of the air conditioner, trying to convince himself that what he had experienced underwater was nothing more than a trick of pressure and isolation. The second night, the dream came again, almost identical to the first, except this time the voice called his name twice, and when he woke he was choking, his lungs burning as though he had inhaled water. Aileen had to shake him fully awake, and even then it took several minutes for his breathing to return to normal. She insisted he see a doctor, worried that he was developing some kind of respiratory issue, and he agreed more to reassure her than out of any real concern for his health. The doctor found nothing wrong, no signs of infection or inflammation, and suggested it might be stress-related, perhaps anxiety manifesting in physical symptoms. Lim Hock accepted the diagnosis and the prescription for mild sedatives, but he did not believe it because he knew what he had felt, and it was not anxiety. It was drowning. He was drowning in his sleep, over and over, and the water that filled his lungs tasted of salt and decay, exactly like the water around Pulau Hantu Besar. He decided he would not dive there again, at least not for a while, and he told his supervisor he needed to take a few days off, citing personal reasons. His supervisor, a pragmatic man who cared more about schedules than excuses, was not pleased, but he granted the leave, and Lim Hock spent the next 2 days at home, trying to distract himself with household chores and television. It did not help. The dreams continued, each one more vivid and suffocating than the last, and on the fourth night he woke to find himself standing in the bathroom, the sink filled with water and his face submerged, his hands gripping the edges of the basin so tightly his knuckles were white. Aileen found him like that, gasping and dripping, and she began to cry, telling him he needed help, real help, because this was not normal. Lim Hock could not argue with her. He made an appointment with a sleep specialist, but the earliest available slot was 2 weeks away, and he knew he could not wait that long. He began researching the island, digging into local archives, and interviewing old fishermen who still remembered the stories their grandparents had told. What he learned disturbed him more than the dreams. There were accounts, going back more than a century, of divers and swimmers who had disappeared near Pulau Hantu Besar, their bodies sometimes found days later washed up on distant shores, bloated and unrecognizable. The stories all shared a common detail, that the victims had been heard calling out to people on shore, speaking names of friends or family members as though trying to lure them into the water. One account, recorded by a British colonial officer in the 1890s, described a woman seen rising from the mangroves at low tide, her skin pale and her hair tangled with seaweed, calling to passing fishermen in a voice that sounded like their wives or daughters. The officer had dismissed it as mass hysteria, but the fishermen had insisted it was real, and they had stopped going near the island after dark. Lim Hock found references to similar sightings in more recent records, always the same description. A pale figure emerging from the water, always calling names, always luring. The entity, if it was an entity, seemed to have one rule: it only called the living, never the dead, and anyone who answered suffered consequences that were described vaguely as misfortune or madness. The details were sparse, but the pattern was consistent enough to be unsettling. On the seventh night, Lim Hock did not go to sleep. He sat in his living room with all the lights on, drinking coffee and trying to stay alert, but exhaustion crept over him like a fog, and despite his best efforts, he felt himself drifting. The dream came anyway, pulling him under before he could resist. This time he was standing on the beach at Pulau Hantu Besar, the sand wet beneath his bare feet, the sky overhead dark and starless. The water lapped at the shore in slow rhythmic waves, and he could see something moving in the shallows, a figure rising from the surf, pale and dripping. It was a woman, or something that had once been a woman, her skin bleached and waterlogged, her hair hanging in thick ropes of seaweed and algae. She moved toward him with a grace that was both beautiful and unnatural, her feet never quite touching the ground. And when she spoke his name, it was in Aileen's voice, perfect in every inflection, and Lim Hock felt his resolve crumble. He wanted to go to her, wanted to answer, but some part of him remembered the warnings and held him back. The figure stopped a few meters away, tilting its head as though confused, and then it opened its mouth impossibly wide, revealing rows of small, sharp teeth and a throat that seemed to go on forever. It called his name again, and this time the voice was his own, distorted and pleading, and Lim Hock understood with cold clarity that this thing had been listening to him, learning him, preparing to take his place. He tried to wake up, tried to force himself back to consciousness, but the dream held him fast, and the figure was moving closer now, reaching for him with hands that ended in long gray fingers, and he could smell the rot coming off it in waves. He woke on the floor of his living room, vomiting seawater, his clothes soaked through as though he had been swimming. Aileen was screaming, calling for an ambulance, but Lim Hock pushed her away and stumbled to the bathroom, where he vomited again, expelling more water than should have been possible. His lungs ached, his throat burned, and his vision was blurred, but he forced himself to stand and look in the mirror. His reflection stared back, pale and hollow-eyed, and there was something tangled in his hair, a strand of dark green seaweed that should not have been there. He pulled it out slowly, holding it up to the light, and it writhed in his fingers like a living thing before disintegrating into slime. He knew then that the dreams were not dreams, that he was being pulled somewhere, taken a little further each night, and that if he fell asleep again, he might not come back. Aileen insisted they go to the hospital, and he did not resist, because he needed answers, and he needed them from someone who might understand. The emergency room doctor examined him and found salt water in his lungs, a significant amount, and she asked how long he had been submerged and where the incident had occurred. Lim Hock had no answer that made sense, so he said nothing, and the doctor admitted him for observation, concerned about secondary drowning and possible infection. He stayed in the hospital for 2 days, hooked to monitors and IV drips, and he did not sleep. The nurses gave him sedatives, but he refused to take them because he knew sleep was the doorway, and he could not risk opening it again. On the second night, as he lay staring at the ceiling, he heard tapping on the window of his room, a soft, persistent rhythm that drew his attention despite his exhaustion. He turned his head and saw a figure standing outside, pressed against the glass, its face pale and featureless in the darkness. It was 7 stories up. There should have been no way for anyone to be there, but the figure remained, tapping with long gray fingers, and Lim Hock watched in numb horror as it pressed its mouth to the glass and spoke his name, the sound muffled but unmistakable. The monitors around him began to beep erratically, his heart rate spiking, and nurses rushed in, asking what was wrong. But when they looked at the window, there was nothing there, only the reflection of the room in the distant city lights. Lim Hock discharged himself the next morning against medical advice, because he understood now that the hospital could not protect him, that nowhere could, and that he had only one option left. He drove to Pulau Hantu Besar at dawn, renting a small motorboat and navigating the narrow channels between the islands until he reached the beach where his nightmare had taken place. The sun was just rising, casting long shadows across the sand, and the air was cool and still, carrying the smell of salt and rotting vegetation. Lim Hock anchored the boat and waded ashore, his dive equipment slung over his shoulder, and he stood at the water's edge, staring out at the dark expanse. He knew what he had to do, what the entity wanted, and he knew that resisting would only prolong the inevitable. He had already drowned 7 times in his sleep, and each time he had been pulled a little deeper, a little closer to whatever waited beneath the surface. If he didn't face it now, on his terms, it would take him anyway, and when it did, there would be nothing left of Lim Hock to come back. He pulled on his wetsuit, checked his tank, and walked into the water, letting the waves close over his head. The descent was slow and deliberate, the water growing colder and darker with each meter, and he swam toward the coordinates he had memorized from his last dive, the place where he had first heard his name. The visibility was less than a meter, the water clouded with silt and organic debris, and he navigated by compass and instinct, moving deeper until his depth gauge read 20 meters, and the pressure made his ears ache. He stopped there, hanging in the water, and waited. The voice came almost immediately, rising from the darkness below, calling his name with a familiarity that made his chest tighten. He did not answer, but he did not flee either, and after a moment he saw movement, a pale shape rising toward him through the murk. It was the woman from his dreams, or what had become of her, her body elongated and boneless, her limbs too long and jointed in ways that defied anatomy. She moved through the water like smoke, her hair spreading around her in a halo of seaweed, and when she reached him, she circled slowly, studying him with eyes that were black and depthless. Lim Hock forced himself to remain still, even as every instinct screamed at him to surface, to escape, and the entity drifted closer until her face was inches from his mask. She opened her mouth, and inside he saw not teeth, but dozens of tiny translucent fish, swimming in and out of her throat, and she spoke his name one final time, not in Aileen's voice or his own, but in a sound that was older and stranger, a language that predated words. Lim Hock understood somehow that this was a claim, that by hearing his name twice he had been marked, and that the only way to break the claim was to give something in return. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a photograph of himself and Aileen, taken on their wedding day, and he held it out to the entity, offering it in exchange for his release. The entity took the photograph with fingers that passed through the laminated surface as though it were water, and she held it up to the faint light filtering from above. For a moment, nothing happened, and then the photograph began to dissolve, the image bleeding into the water, and Lim Hawk felt something inside him tear loose, a part of himself he could not name, and he knew the trade was complete. The entity released him, drifting back into the darkness, and Lim Hawk surfaced as fast as his training allowed, breaking into the light and gasping for air. He hauled himself into the boat and lay trembling on the deck, his body shaking with cold and adrenaline, and he could not tell if he had won or lost. The dream stopped after that, and the drowning sensation ceased. But Lim Hawk was never the same. He returned to work, but he moved through his days as though watching from a distance, detached and hollow. Aileen noticed the change and tried to reach him, but he could not explain what he had given up, could not find the words to describe the emptiness where something vital had been. He stopped diving, stopped going near the water altogether, and he avoided looking at photographs because every image of himself now seemed faint and transparent, as though he were fading from the world one piece at a time. Fishermen still report seeing a pale figure rising from the mangroves near Pulau Hantu Besar, calling names into the wind, and those who know the story say it no longer sounds like a woman, but like a man, his voice distant and pleading, asking to be remembered. I hope you enjoyed these stories. Tomorrow we will be uploading another terrifying story. Feel free to subscribe and put on your notifications to never miss another scary video. I upload almost every day. Wish you all the best. The stories we have shared so far reveal only a fraction of the terror that lingers in the forgotten corners of Asia, places where the past refuses to stay buried and the line between the living and the dead grows dangerously thin. But these are just the beginning, because what comes next pushes beyond simple hauntings and ventures into territory where logic collapses, and the very nature of reality becomes uncertain. In the next part, we will explore events that defy explanation, where the horror is not in what is seen, but in what cannot be understood, and where those who seek answers often discover that some truths are too terrible to bear. If you want to, there's a link to buy me a coffee in the description. Only if you want to, of course. I already appreciate you listening to my videos. Now let us continue into the darkness, where the next stories await. The first time David Thornton saw the man pacing on the platform at Than Zayat station, he assumed it was a local resident waiting for a train that no longer ran. But when he approached to ask for directions, the figure turned, and David saw the broken chain hanging from his wrist, the metal links corroded and ancient, and he heard the man whispering numbers in a monotone voice that seemed to come from somewhere far away. David stopped walking, his camera hanging forgotten around his neck, and the man continued pacing, back and forth along the cracked concrete, his lips moving in an endless recitation of codes that meant nothing to David, but carried the weight of something terrible. The man wore what looked like a prisoner of war uniform, faded and stained, the fabric hanging loose on a frame that seemed too thin to support life. And when David tried to speak, tried to ask if the man needed help, the figure simply turned away and continued pacing. And David realized with a cold certainty that he was looking at something that should not exist. David Thornton was a British documentary filmmaker, 41 years old, specializing in World War II history, and he had come to Myanmar to research the Death Railway, the brutal construction project that had claimed thousands of lives during the Japanese occupation. Than Zayat had been the starting point of the railway, a place where Allied prisoners of war and Southeast Asian laborers had been forced to work under conditions so horrific that the line had earned its grim nickname from the sheer number of deaths it caused. David had spent months preparing for this trip, reviewing historical records and survivor testimonies, and he had received permission from local authorities to film at the old station and along sections of the abandoned railway. He had expected to find ruins and overgrown tracks, the physical remnants of a dark chapter in history, but he had not expected to encounter anything that defied rational explanation. The station itself was a low wooden structure that had been partially restored as a memorial site, with informational plaques describing the suffering that had taken place there and a small museum housing artifacts recovered from the construction camps. David had arrived in the late afternoon, planning to capture footage of the station at sunset when the light would be most dramatic, and he had been setting up his equipment when he noticed the man on the platform. At first glance, the figure had seemed ordinary enough, just another person visiting the site. But as David watched, he began to notice details that did not add up. The man's clothing was wrong, too authentic to be a costume, too weathered to be anything but genuine, and his movements were repetitive and mechanical, lacking the natural variation of a living person. David had worked on enough historical documentaries to recognize period-accurate uniforms, and what this man was wearing matched exactly the descriptions of POW work details from 1942, down to the identification number stenciled on the shirt pocket. That night, David reviewed the footage he had captured, and what he saw on the screen made his hands shake. The man on the platform was visible in every frame, pacing with the same mechanical precision, but the audio track had picked up something David had not consciously heard at the time. The whispered numbers were audible beneath the ambient sounds of a wind and distant traffic, and when David amplified the audio and cleaned up the noise, he could hear them clearly. They were 6-digit codes, spoken in groups of 3, and they continued without pause for the entire duration of the recording. David spent hours transcribing the numbers, filling pages of his notebook with sequences that seemed random but felt significant, and in the morning he took the list to the museum curator, a middle-aged woman named Kin who had worked at the site for over a decade. Kin looked at the numbers and went pale, her hands trembling as she set the paper down, and she told David that he needed to leave Tambu Zayat immediately, that what he had recorded was dangerous and should not be shared. David pressed for an explanation, and Kin reluctantly told him that the numbers were prisoner identification codes, the same codes that had been used to track laborers during the railway construction, but the specific sequences David had recorded did not appear in any official records. They were ghost codes, IDs that had been assigned but never documented, belonging to men who had vanished without a trace during the war, prisoners who had died or disappeared in ways the Japanese administrators had wanted to conceal. David refused to leave. He had come too far and invested too much to abandon the project based on superstition, and he told Kin that he needed to understand what he had witnessed. She warned him that others had tried to investigate the ghost codes before, researchers and historians who had become obsessed with uncovering the truth, and that none of them had found answers that brought them peace. Some had left Myanmar abruptly, refusing to speak about what they had learned, and others had stayed too long and suffered consequences Kin would not specify. David dismissed her concerns as exaggeration, the kind of cautionary tales that always surrounded places with violent histories, and he returned to the station that evening with more sophisticated recording equipment, determined to capture evidence that could be analyzed and verified. He set up multiple cameras and audio recorders, positioning them at different angles along the platform, and he waited as the sun set and the shadows grew long. The man appeared exactly as before, emerging from the far end of the platform, as though he had been there all along, but had only just become visible. And he began pacing with the same repetitive motion, his lips moving in the familiar recitation of numbers. David watched through the viewfinder of his camera, documenting every detail, and as the light faded, he noticed something new. The broken chain on the man's wrist was not just hanging loose, it was attached to something invisible, something that pulled taut whenever the man reached the end of his pacing route, as though he were still shackled to a work detail that existed only in memory. David approached slowly, keeping his camera rolling, and as he drew closer he could see the man's face more clearly. It was gaunt and hollow, the skin stretched tight over bones that seemed too prominent, and the eyes were open but unfocused, staring at nothing. The man did not acknowledge David's presence, did not react when David spoke his name or asked questions, and David realized with growing unease that the figure was trapped in a loop, endlessly repeating the same actions with no awareness of the present. He reached out, intending to touch the man's shoulder, to see if physical contact would provoke a response. But before his hand made contact, the figure stopped pacing and turned to face him. The movement was sudden and unnatural, like a marionette jerked by invisible strings. And when the man's eyes focused on David, they were filled with a desperation so intense it was almost unbearable to witness. The man opened his mouth, and instead of numbers, he spoke a single word in English. The accent British and educated, the voice raw with exhaustion. He said, "Remember." And then he reached out with the hand bearing the broken chain and pressed his palm against David's chest, and David felt a cold shock pass through him, a sensation like ice water flooding his veins, and he staggered backward, gasping. The man resumed pacing as though nothing had happened, the numbers flowing from his lips in an unbroken stream, and David fumbled with his camera, trying to capture what had just occurred, but his hands were shaking too badly to hold the equipment steady. He fled the station, leaving his gear behind, and drove back to his hotel in a state of near panic. His chest ached where the man had touched him, a deep bruising pain that radiated outward, and when he examined himself in the bathroom mirror, he saw a mark, faint but unmistakable, the shape of a hand pressed into his skin as though burned there. He did not sleep that night, afraid of what might come if he closed his eyes, and in the morning he returned to the station to retrieve his equipment. The cameras and recorders were exactly where he had left them, undisturbed, and when he reviewed the footage, he found that everything had been captured in perfect clarity. The man on the platform was visible in every frame, and the moment when he had pressed his hand to David's chest was recorded from multiple angles, showing the figure's desperate expression and the way David had recoiled. But there was something else, something David had not noticed in the moment. In the background of every shot, barely visible in the shadows beyond the platform, there were more figures, dozens of them, all wearing the same prison uniforms, all moving with the same mechanical repetition, and they were all whispering numbers. David zoomed in on the faces of these background figures and felt his stomach drop. They were emaciated and hollow-eyed, their expressions blank, and they were staring directly at the camera, as though they knew they were being recorded and were trying to communicate something through their presence alone. David spent the next week cross-referencing the numbers from his recordings with historical archives, trying to identify the prisoners whose codes had been whispered by the ghost on the platform. The archives were incomplete, many records having been destroyed during the war or lost in the decades since. But David was able to trace some of the codes to specific individuals. They were British, Australian, and Dutch soldiers captured during the fall of Singapore and sent to work on the death railway, and their fates were recorded with bureaucratic precision in surviving Japanese documents. Most had died of disease or malnutrition, their bodies buried in unmarked graves along the railway line, but a significant number had simply disappeared from the records, listed as transferred or released, but with no documentation of where they had gone or what had happened to them. David found references to a labor camp near Thambuzayat, where conditions had been particularly brutal, and where a large number of prisoners had died in a single month, far more than the official reports acknowledged. Survivors of the camp had testified after the war that men had been worked to death and their bodies disposed of in secret, dumped into rivers or burned to hide the evidence, and that the camp administrators had falsified records to avoid accountability. The ghost codes, David realized, belonged to these erased men, prisoners whose existence had been systematically removed from history, and the figure on the platform was somehow trying to restore them, to make their suffering known. On the 8th night, David woke to find himself standing on the platform at Thambuzayat station, though he had no memory of leaving his hotel or driving there. The moon was full, casting pale light across the empty tracks, and the air was cold and still, carrying a smell of rust and decay. The man in the POW uniform was there, pacing as always, and as David watched, he saw the other figures emerge from the shadows, a crowd of gaunt spectral forms surrounding the platform, all of them whispering numbers in a chorus that rose and fell like a tide. David tried to move, tried to run, but his body would not respond, and he realized with horror that he was standing exactly where he had been touched, exactly where the ghost's hand had pressed into his chest. The figures began to move toward him, slowly and deliberately, and as they drew closer, David could see the chains on their wrists, all of them broken, all of them trailing links that sparked and dragged across the concrete. They reached for him with skeletal hands, their faces expressionless, and David understood that they wanted something from him, some acknowledgement or action that would release them from their endless loop. He tried to speak, to tell them he would help, but the words would not come, and the figures surrounded him, their whispers growing louder, the numbers blending into a cacophony that filled his head and drowned out all other thought. He woke in the hospital 3 days later, found by a passing truck driver on the roadside several kilometers from Tambiuzayat, delirious and dehydrated. He had no memory of how he had gotten there, no explanation for the days that had passed, and the doctors could find no physical cause for his condition beyond exhaustion and exposure. Kin visited him and brought his belongings, including his camera equipment, which had been recovered from the station. She told him quietly that she had reviewed his footage and then erased it, not out of malice, but out of necessity, because what he had captured was too dangerous to share, too likely to draw others into the same trap. David protested weakly, but he knew she was right. He left Myanmar a week later against medical advice and returned to the UK with a determination to document what he had learned, to give names and recognition to the men whose codes had been whispered on that platform. He published a book 2 years later, a meticulously researched history of the forgotten prisoners of the Death Railway, and in the appendix he included a list of the ghost codes, the identification numbers that had been erased from official records, but preserved in the memories of those who had suffered. The book was well received by historians, but largely ignored by the general public, and David never spoke publicly about what he had experienced at Tan Biuzayat station. The nights he still wakes from dreams where he is standing on that platform, surrounded by figures who will not stop whispering, who will not let him forget. The station remains a memorial site, visited by tourists and researchers, and sometimes, in the late afternoon when the light begins to fade, visitors report seeing a man in an old uniform pacing the platform, his lips moving in silence, and those who listen closely say they can hear numbers, faint and endless, codes that belong to men the world has forgotten. I hope you enjoyed these stories. Tomorrow we will be uploading another terrifying story. Feel free to subscribe and put on your notifications to never miss another scary video. I upload almost every day. Wish you all the best, yet for all the horror that clings to places marked by war and suffering, there are other locations where the terror is older and stranger, where the earth itself seems to hold memories that predate human understanding. In Indonesia, where ancient volcanic forces shaped the landscape and created legends that still echo through the highlands, there exists a place where the dead do not simply haunt, they mirror, and those who encounter them are forced to confront something far more disturbing than ghosts. They're confronted with versions of themselves that should never have existed, reflections of lives unlived and futures erased by disasters beyond comprehension. The first time Sariwijaya saw the woman on the ridge overlooking Lake Toba, she thought it was another hiker pausing to admire the view, but as she approached, she noticed that the woman's hair was moving in a way that had nothing to do with the wind, rippling and flowing as though underwater, and when Sari called out a greeting, the woman turned slowly to face her, and Sari found herself staring at her own face, identical in every detail except older, the skin gray and lifeless, the eyes empty of anything that could be called human. Sari stopped walking, her breath catching in her throat, and the woman on the ridge smiled with Sari's own mouth, a gesture so familiar and yet so wrong that Sari felt her legs go weak. And before she could speak or move or do anything, the figure raised one hand and pointed down toward the lake far below, and Sari understood with terrible clarity that she was looking at a version of herself who had died in the ancient eruption that had created this place. a shadow of a life that had been erased 74,000 years ago. Sari was 28 years old, a geologist from Jakarta specializing in volcanic formations, and she had come to Lake Toba to study the caldera and collect samples for her research on supervolcanic events. Toba was one of the largest volcanic lakes in the world, formed by a catastrophic eruption that had nearly driven humanity to extinction, and Sari had been fascinated by the site since her undergraduate studies. She had read every paper published on the eruption, knew the estimates of ash dispersal and climate impact, and understood intellectually the magnitude of destruction that had occurred here. But standing on the ridge above the lake, confronted with her own dead face, she felt the knowledge crumble into something visceral and terrifying. She had arrived in Sumatra 3 days earlier, joining a small research team that was mapping geothermal activity around the caldera, and she had spent her mornings hiking the trails that wound along the ridges, photographing rock formations and taking notes on erosion patterns. The locals had been friendly but cautious, warning her to avoid hiking alone at dusk when the light played tricks and the boundaries between the living world and the spirit world grew thin. Sari had nodded politely and ignored the warnings, attributing them to the kind of folklore that always accumulated around geologically active areas. But now, staring at the figure on the ridge, she wished she had listened. The woman, or the thing that wore her face, remained motionless except for the impossible movement of her hair, and Sari realized she was waiting for something, some response or acknowledgement that would complete whatever interaction had been initiated. Sari forced herself to speak, to ask who or what the figure was, and her voice came out thin and unsteady. The woman did not answer with words, but instead she tilted her head in a gesture Sari recognized as her own, something she did when confused or considering a problem, and the familiarity of it was more disturbing than any supernatural display could have been. The figure took a step forward, and Sari saw that she left no footprints on the dusty trail, her feet hovering just above the ground, and as she moved closer, Sari could see that her clothing was wrong. Not modern hiking gear, but something older, leather and woven fiber, the kind of garments that might have been worn by people who lived in this region thousands of years ago. The woman stopped an arm's length away, close enough that Sari could see the texture of her skin, which was not skin at all, but something like volcanic ash, fine and gray and slightly luminous in the fading light. Sari wanted to run, wanted to scream, but she found herself frozen, unable to look away from the face that was hers, but not hers. And the woman reached out with one hand and touched Sari's forehead with a fingertip, and Sari felt the world lurch sideways. She was standing in the same place, but the landscape was different. The ridge barren and covered in a thick layer of ash that stretched as far as she could see. The sky was dark, choked with smoke and particulate matter that blotted out the sun, and the air was hot and acrid, burning her lungs with every breath. Sari looked down at herself and saw that she was wearing the same primitive clothing as the woman, her hands rough and calloused, her body thin from hunger. She was not alone. There were others nearby, huddled figures moving through the ashfall with the slow determination of people who had nowhere left to go, and Sari understood without being told that she was experiencing a memory, not her own, but belonging to someone who had lived and died here when the volcano erupted. She tried to call out to the other figures, but her voice made no sound, and she realized she was not fully present in this vision, only observing, a ghost watching ghosts. The ash continued to fall, thick and relentless, and Sari watched as the figures began to collapse, one by one, their bodies disappearing beneath the gray blanket that covered everything. She felt herself sinking too, felt the weight of the ash pressing down on her chest and filling her mouth, and she understood that this was how they had died, buried alive in a landscape that had turned hostile in a matter of hours, and she was drowning in ash, just as they had, and the panic was absolute. She came back to herself gasping, bent double on the trail, her hands pressed to the ground as though to anchor herself to the present. The woman on the ridge was gone, but Sari could still feel the ghost of her touch on her forehead, a cold spot that throbbed with each heartbeat. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the lake, and Sari realized with a jolt that several minutes had passed. Though the vision had felt like hours, she stumbled down the trail toward the research camp, her legs unsteady, her mind reeling from what she had experienced. She tried to rationalize it, to explain it as a hallucination brought on by altitude or dehydration, but she knew that was not true because the details of the vision had been too specific, too consistent with the archaeological evidence of how people had died during the Toba eruption. She had seen things she could not have known, the texture of the ash, the way it clung and smothered, the expressions on the faces of the dying, and she could not shake the feeling that the vision had been a message, a warning, or perhaps an accusation from the past. That night, Sari told her research team what had happened, and their reactions ranged from skepticism to concern. The team leader, an older geologist named Booty, suggested she take a day to rest and recover, attributing the experience to stress or a minor medical event. But one of the local guides, a Batak man named Parlin Dungan, took her aside and told her quietly that she was not the first person to see such things on the ridge. He said that the woman with the moving hair was a known presence, a spirit that appeared to certain visitors and showed them visions of the eruption, and that the local people called her the Mirror Woman because she always took the face of whoever looked at her. Parlin Dungan explained that the Batak believed the eruption had created a kind of scar in the fabric of reality, a place where time folded back on itself, and the dead could reach across the boundary to touch the living. The Mirror Woman, he said, was not trying to harm anyone. She was trying to remember, to preserve the memory of what had happened and who had been lost, and those who saw her were chosen for reasons no one fully understood. Sari asked what happened to the people who encountered the Mirror Woman, and Parlin Dungan hesitated before answering. He said that some left the area immediately and never spoke of it again, while others became obsessed, returning to the ridge night after night, seeking the vision again, trying to understand or perhaps to atone for surviving when so many had died. A few, he said, had never come back from the ridge at all, their bodies found days later at the base of the cliffs, and no one could say whether they had fallen or jumped. Sari did not sleep that night, lying awake in her tent and listening to the sounds of the forest, the distant calls of night birds, and the rustle of small animals in the undergrowth. She kept seeing the face of the Mirror Woman, her own face aged and lifeless, and she kept feeling the weight of the ash pressing down, suffocating and inescapable. In the morning, she told Booty that she was going to continue her field work, that she was fine and did not need a day off, because sitting idle would only make things worse, and Booty reluctantly agreed, assigning her to survey a section of the ridge several kilometers from where she had encountered the spirit. Sari hiked alone, carrying her equipment and trying to focus on the work, taking measurements and collecting samples, but she found her gaze drawn repeatedly to the lake below, to the vast expanse of water that filled the caldera and hid the true scale of the destruction beneath. She thought about the people who had lived here before the eruption, the communities that had been wiped out in an instant, and she wondered how many of them had known what was coming, if they had felt the ground tremble and seen the signs but had nowhere to run. The vision she had experienced suggested they had tried to flee, had walked through the falling ash with desperate hope, and she wondered if the Mirror Woman was one of them, a survivor of the initial blast who had died slowly in the aftermath, and who now existed in some liminal state, trapped between the moment of death and the present. On the third night, Sari woke to find herself standing on the ridge again, though she had no memory of leaving her tent or climbing the trail. The moon was nearly full, bright enough to cast shadows, and the lake below gleamed like polished silver. The Mirror Woman was there, waiting, her hair moving in that same impossible way. And this time Sari did not feel afraid, only a deep, exhausted curiosity. She walked forward until she was standing face to face with the spirit, and she asked the question that had been consuming her since the first encounter. She asked why the Mirror Woman showed people their own faces, why she chose to appear as the person who was looking at her. The spirit did not answer with words, but she reached out and took Sari's hand. And this time, the vision was different, clearer and more controlled. Sari saw not just the eruption and its aftermath, but the lives that had been lived before it. The generations of people who had farmed and fished and built homes on the slopes of the volcano, unaware that they were living on a time bomb. She saw families and children, elders and craftsmen, all going about their lives with the same mundane concerns that people have always had, and she saw the moment when everything changed. The ground splitting open and the sky turning black, and she felt the terror and confusion as the world ended. But more than that, she felt the loss, the erasure of countless possible futures, lives that would never be lived, children who would never be born, discoveries and creations that would never happen. And she understood that the mirror woman was showing her what the eruption had stolen, not just the people who died, but the potential they carried. Sari found herself weeping, tears streaming down her face, and the mirror woman released her hand and stepped back. For the first time, the spirit spoke, and her voice was Sari's voice, but layered with others, a chorus of women speaking in unison. She said, "You carry us forward, you remember what was lost, and that is enough." The figure began to fade, her form becoming translucent, and Sari reached out instinctively, wanting to hold on, to ask more questions. But the spirit was already gone, dissolving into the moonlight. Sari stood alone on the ridge, shaking and drained, and as the adrenaline faded, she felt a strange sense of peace, as though a burden she had not known she was carrying had been lifted. She understood now that the mirror woman was not a threat or a curse, but a guardian of memory, a witness to catastrophe, and that those who saw her were being trusted with something precious, the knowledge of what had been and what could still be lost. Sari returned to camp before dawn, moving quietly so as not to wake her colleagues, and she lay in her tent watching the sky lighten, thinking about the generations of people who had lived and died on these slopes, and about her own place in the long chain of survivors. She left Lake Toba 2 days later, her research complete, and she did not speak publicly about what she had experienced on the ridge. She wrote her papers and presented her findings at conferences, contributing to the scientific understanding of supervolcanic events. But she also began volunteering with cultural preservation projects, working with indigenous communities to document oral histories and traditional knowledge that might otherwise be lost. She thought often about the mirror woman and the vision she had been shown, and she carried with her a deeper appreciation for the fragility of human existence and the importance of remembering those who came before. Other hikers continue to report sightings on the ridge above Lake Toba, always at dusk, always the same woman with hair that moves without wind, and always the moment of recognition when they see their own face looking back at them. Older and transformed by death, local guides warn visitors not to speak if they encounter the spirit, because speaking makes the vision more intense, more personal. But some people ignore the warnings, compelled by curiosity or disbelief, and they walk away, changed, haunted by the knowledge of what they might have been in another timeline, another world where the volcano never erupted and humanity was not reduced to a remnant clinging to survival. I hope you enjoyed these stories. Tomorrow we will be uploading another terrifying story. Feel free to subscribe and put on your notifications to never miss another scary video. I upload almost every day. Wish you all the best. The last 2 stories are different. They are quieter, but far more disturbing, the kind that stay with you long after the telling ends. What we have heard so far involved direct confrontations with the supernatural, moments where the boundary between worlds became visible and undeniable. But what comes next is more subtle and perhaps more terrible because of it. These are stories where the horror creeps in slowly, where the signs are easy to miss until it is too late, and where the protagonists discover that some curses do not announce themselves with spectacle or violence, but instead they burrow deep into the fabric of everyday life and twist it into something unrecognizable. In the final part, we will explore 2 more accounts from across Asia, Tales that remind us that the most frightening things are not always the ones we can see, but the ones that change us from within, that rewrite our memories and our identities until we can no longer trust even ourselves. The first time Marcus Brennan noticed his shadow moving opposite to the light, he was deep inside the Pa'u caves along the Mekong River, photographing the thousands of Buddha statues that filled the limestone chambers, and he assumed it was a trick of the flickering candlelight the pilgrims had left burning on small altars throughout the cave. But when he turned his flashlight directly toward the wall where his shadow should have been cast, he saw instead a dark silhouette moving away from the beam, sliding along the rock face in the wrong direction. And when he stopped walking, the shadow stopped too, mirroring his stillness, but positioned where no shadow had any right to be. Marcus stood frozen, his camera hanging forgotten in his hand, and he heard something behind him, a soft rhythmic sound like chanting, and the voice was his own, speaking words he did not know in a language he did not recognize. And the realization that something in the cave was using his voice made his skin crawl with a primal fear he had never experienced before. Marcus was a travel photographer from Australia, 36 years old, specializing in religious sites and cultural heritage locations across Southeast Asia. He had been working on a photo essay about Buddhist pilgrimage sites, documenting the rituals and architecture that drew believers from across the region, and the Paku caves had been on his list for months. The caves were located about 25 kilometers upriver from Luang Prabang, accessible only by boat, and they were famous for housing thousands of Buddha statues in various sizes, in states of repair, offerings left by pilgrims over centuries. Marcus had hired a local boatman named Kamsing to take him to the caves in the late afternoon, planning to capture the way sunlight filtered through the cave mouth and illuminated the statues in the upper chamber. Kamsing had been reluctant to make the trip so late in the day, insisting that the caves were not safe after dark, that something lived in the deeper passages that did not welcome visitors. But Marcus had offered extra money, and Kamsing had eventually agreed, though he made it clear he would not enter the caves himself and would wait at the dock until Marcus returned. Marcus had dismissed the warning as the usual superstition that accompanied tourist sites, the kind of story meant to add mystery and perhaps justify higher fees, and he had climbed the steep stairs to the cave entrance with his equipment, excited about the photographs he would capture in the fading light. The lower cave was vast and filled with statues of every size, from tiny hand-carved figures to life-sized representations, all arranged on shelves and ledges cut into the rock. The air smelled of incense and bat guano, and the floor was uneven, covered in a fine dust that rose with each step. Marcus spent an hour setting up shots, adjusting his camera settings to compensate for the low light, and he was so focused on his work that he did not notice when the sun set and the cave entrance grew dark. It was only when he finished photographing the lower chamber and climbed the ladder to the upper cave that he realized how late it had become and how isolated he was. The upper cave was smaller and more claustrophobic, the ceiling lower and the passages narrower, and the statues here were older, more weathered, their features worn smooth by time and moisture. Marcus moved carefully, his flashlight casting long shadows that danced across the walls, and he was lining up a shot of a particularly ancient Buddha when he first noticed the shadow moving wrong. He had turned to adjust his angle, and his shadow should have moved with him, but instead it had slid to the left, maintaining its position relative to something other than his light source. And when he pointed his flashlight directly at it, the shadow had retreated, flowing along the wall like liquid darkness. Marcus told himself it was an optical illusion, a product of multiple light sources and reflective surfaces. But as he continued working, he kept seeing it, the shadow that refused to behave as shadows should, always present at the edge of his vision, always moving just slightly out of sync. He tried to photograph it, to capture evidence of what he was seeing, but every time he raised his camera, the shadow would vanish, disappearing into the general darkness of the cave, and he would be left staring at an empty wall, wondering if he had imagined the whole thing. The unease that had been building in his chest intensified, and he decided it was time to leave, to pack up his equipment and return to the boat while he still had enough light to navigate the stairs safely. He was gathering his gear when he heard the chanting, faint at first but growing louder, and it was definitely his voice, his accent, his particular way of pronouncing vowels, but the words were unfamiliar, a stream of syllables that sounded vaguely like Pali or Sanskrit, but distorted somehow, as though being spoken through water or from a great distance. Marcus spun around, shining his flashlight into the deeper passages of the cave, calling out to ask if someone was there, if this was a joke, but the only response was the echo of his own voice and the continuation of the chanting, which seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. He moved toward the ladder that led back down to the lower cave, but as he reached for the first rung, he saw the shadow again, this time cast on the floor directly in front of him, and it was not his shadow. It was humanoid but wrong, the proportions slightly off, the limbs too long and the head too large, and it was standing perfectly still even though Marcus was moving. He stepped back, and the shadow remained where it was, and then it began to change, its form rippling and shifting, and Marcus watched in horror as it started to mimic his movements, not in real time, but delayed by a second or two, as though learning how to copy him. He backed away from the ladder, retreating deeper into the upper cave, and the shadow followed, always maintaining the same distance, always moving in the same jerky, unnatural way. The chanting grew louder, and Marcus realized with a sickening clarity that it was not just his voice he was hearing, it was his words, things he had said earlier in the day to Kamsing, conversations he had recorded on his phone for voice memos, phrases he had muttered to himself while setting up shots, all of it being played back in a jumbled sequence that made no sense but proved that something had been listening, recording, learning. Marcus ran, abandoning his expensive camera equipment and fleeing toward the cave entrance, his flashlight beam bouncing wildly as he stumbled over uneven ground. He could hear the shadow behind him, not footsteps exactly, but a sliding scraping sound, like something dragging itself across stone, and the chanting was all around him now, his voice speaking from every corner of the cave in a dissonant chorus that made his head throb. He reached the ladder and practically fell down it, his hands slipping on the worn rungs, and he hit the floor of the lower cave hard, pain shooting through his ankle. He forced himself to stand and limp toward the entrance, the last light of dusk barely visible ahead, and as he crossed the threshold he felt something brush past him, a cold presence that made the air shimmer, and he knew without looking that the shadow had followed him out. He stumbled down the stairs to the dock, shouting for Kamsing, and the boatman took one look at Marcus's face and immediately started the engine, not waiting for an explanation, just pulling away from the dock as fast as the small boat could manage. Marcus collapsed onto one of the wooden benches, gasping and shaking, and he looked back at the cave entrance high on the cliff face, and he saw it, a dark silhouette standing at the mouth of the cave, perfectly still, watching him leave. That night in his hotel room in Luang Prabang, Marcos tried to rationalize what had happened, to find a scientific explanation for the shadow and the voices, but every theory he constructed fell apart under scrutiny. He had not been dehydrated or oxygen deprived. He had not taken any medications or substances that could cause hallucinations, and the experiences had been too consistent and too specific to be dismissed as imagination. He reviewed the photographs he had taken before abandoning his camera, and in several of the images he could see the shadow in the background, a dark, blurred shape that should not have been there given the lighting conditions, and in one particularly clear shot, he could see what looked like a face forming in the shadow, features that resembled his own but subtly wrong, the eyes too wide and the mouth stretched in an expression that was neither smile nor grimace, but something else entirely. Marcus deleted the images immediately, a gut reaction he could not explain, and then he emptied his camera's trash folder and did a full factory reset, because the idea of those images existing anywhere felt dangerous, as though they might allow the thing from the cave to follow him through digital space. He did not sleep that night, lying in bed and listening to the sounds of the city outside his window, and every so often he would catch movement in his peripheral vision, a flicker of darkness that vanished when he turned to look directly at it. Over the next 3 days, Marcus tried to leave Laos, but every attempt was thwarted by delays and cancellations that felt too coincidental to be random. His flight to Bangkok was canceled due to mechanical issues. The next available flight was booked solid. The bus he tried to take broke down an hour outside of Luang Prabang, and when he attempted to hire a private car, the driver refused to take him. After looking at Marcus for a long moment and shaking his head, muttering something in Lao that Marcus did not understand but recognized as refusal, Marcus felt trapped, and worse, he felt watched, as though something was ensuring he could not leave until some condition was met or some debt was paid. He returned to the hotel and asked the staff if they knew anyone who understood local spiritual traditions, someone who might be able to explain what was happening, and the receptionist, a young woman named Vanna, gave him the contact information for a monk at one of the local temples who was known for dealing with supernatural problems. Marcus met with the monk the next morning, an elderly man named Fra Somchai, who listened carefully to Marcus's story without interruption, his expression growing more serious as the details emerged. Fra Somchai explained that the Pak U caves were considered spiritually active, a place where the boundary between the physical and spiritual realms was thin, and that certain entities resided there, drawn to the concentrated spiritual energy of thousands of Buddha statues and centuries of devotional practice. One such entity was known as the Echo Spirit, a mimic that existed in the spaces between light and shadow, feeding on the presence of visitors and learning from them, copying their voices and movements in an attempt to understand human consciousness. The Echo Spirit was not inherently malicious, Fara Somchai said, but it was curious and possessive, and once it became interested in someone, it would follow them, observing and imitating, and over time the person would begin to lose their sense of self as the spirit's mimicry became more perfect. The only way to break the connection was to return to the cave and complete a ritual of separation, offering something personal to the spirit in exchange for release, something that carried memory and identity. Marcus asked what would happen if he did not return, and Fra Somchai's answer was bleak. The spirit would continue to learn, to refine its imitation, and eventually it would be able to replace Marcus entirely, not physically but spiritually, wearing his identity like a mask while his true self faded into the background, becoming the shadow while the shadow became him. Marcus returned to the Paku caves the following afternoon, accompanied by Fra Somchai and a different boatman who agreed to make the trip only because the monk was present. Marcus carried with him a small leather journal he had kept since he started traveling, filled with notes and sketches and photographs he had glued onto the pages, a record of everywhere he had been and everything he had experienced. Fra Somchai had told him the offering needed to be something that contained his essence, something that would satisfy the Echo Spirit's curiosity and give it what it wanted without requiring his complete dissolution. They climbed the stairs to the cave as the sun began to set, and Marcus felt the familiar weight of dread settling over him, the sense that he was walking into a trap from which there might be no escape. Inside the upper cave, the shadow was waiting, visible now even in the dim light, standing in the center of the chamber like a patient host. Fra Somchai began to chant, a real chant this time, words in Pali that Marcus did not understand but that seemed to resonate in the stone around them, and he instructed Marcus to place the journal on the ground and step back. Marcus did as he was told, setting the journal down carefully, and the shadow moved toward it, not walking but flowing, and when it reached the journal, it seemed to sink into the pages, the darkness seeping into the paper like ink. The chanting behind him stopped, all the mimicked voices falling silent at once, and Marcus felt something release, a tension he had not fully been aware of snapping like a cord cut clean. The shadow that had been following him was gone, absorbed into the journal, and Marcus felt lighter, more himself, though there was also a sense of loss he could not quite name, as though he had given up not just a possession, but a part of his history. Fra Somchai nodded approvingly and gestured for them to leave, and they descended the stairs quickly, not running, but moving with purpose, and Marcus did not look back. On the boat ride back to Luang Prabang, Marcus asked the monk what would happen to the journal, if the spirit would be trapped there forever, and Fra Somchai said that the spirit had gotten what it wanted, a complete record of a human life, memories and experiences it could study and understand, and that it would remain in the cave, content with its prize, no longer needing to follow Marcus because it already had everything it needed to know him. Marcus left Laos the next day, his flight departing without incident, and he returned to Australia with a sense of relief, tempered by unease. He never published the photographs from Pa U, never wrote about his experience there, and he avoided caves and enclosed spaces for the rest of his life. Sometimes, late at night, he would dream of the shadow, and in the dreams, it was standing in front of a mirror, looking at its own reflection. And the reflection was Marcus, perfect in every detail, and the shadow was smiling. I hope you enjoyed these stories. Tomorrow we will be uploading another terrifying story. If you enjoyed these stories, feel free to subscribe and put on your notifications to never miss another scary video. And if you want to, there's a link to buy me a coffee in the description too. Thank you for listening and wish you all the best. And yet for all the terror that spirits and shadows can bring, there remains one final category of horror that is perhaps the most insidious, the kind that comes wrapped in kindness and generosity, that presents itself as salvation, but extracts a price so subtle you do not realize you have paid it until long after the transaction is complete. This last story takes place on one of Asia's most sacred mountains, a place where pilgrims climb through the night seeking enlightenment and blessing, and where a single act of charity can bind your soul to stone and sky, not violently but gently, so gently that you walk away grateful, never knowing what you have lost until you notice your shadow hesitating, lagging, refusing to follow you into the light. The first time Amara Pereira met the barefoot monk on the mountain path to Sri Pada, she was exhausted and dehydrated, having climbed for 6 hours in darkness, and when he appeared from the shadows, offering water from a simple wooden bowl, she was so grateful she did not think to question where he had come from, or why a monk would be hiking alone at 3 in the morning. She drank deeply, the water cold and clean and somehow sweet, and she thanked him in Sinhala, and he smiled and placed a hand briefly on her shoulder, a gesture of blessing, and then he stepped back into the darkness and was gone before she could ask his name. Amara felt renewed immediately, her fatigue vanishing and her legs strong again, and she continued climbing with an energy that surprised her, reaching the summit just as the sun rose and painting the world in shades of gold and pink. It was only later, as she descended in the full light of day, that she noticed something odd. Her shadow on the stone steps was lagging, falling slightly behind her movements, and when she stopped, the shadow took an extra second to catch up, as though it were walking separately and struggling to keep pace. And the realization that her shadow was no longer entirely her own sent a chill through her, despite the morning heat. Amara was 29 years old, a teacher from Colombo who had decided to climb Sri Pada, also known as Adam's Peak, as part of a personal pilgrimage to mark the end of a difficult year. She had lost her father to illness 8 months earlier, and the grief had been compounded by the dissolution of a long-term relationship and the stress of her job, and she had felt increasingly disconnected from herself, as though she were going through the motions of life without fully inhabiting it. The climb to Sri Pada was something her father had done every year, a tradition he had maintained since his own youth, and Amara had decided to honor his memory by making the journey herself, despite having never been particularly religious or inclined toward physical challenges. The mountain was sacred to Buddhists, Hindus, Muslims, and Christians alike, each tradition claiming the footprint at the summit as belonging to their own prophet or deity. And the pilgrimage season drew thousands of climbers who ascended through the night to reach the peak at sunrise. Amara had joined a group of pilgrims from her father's old temple, mostly elderly people who climbed slowly and steadily, and she had stayed with them for the first few hours. But as her exhaustion grew, she had fallen behind, waving them on and insisting she would catch up. By the time the monk appeared, she had been alone on the mountain for nearly an hour, surrounded by darkness and the sound of distant chanting from pilgrims higher up the trail. The descent should have been easier, gravity assisting rather than resisting. But Amara found herself struggling, not physically but psychologically, because she could not stop watching her shadow and noticing the delay. It was subtle, perhaps a second at most, but it was consistent and undeniable, and it made her feel as though she were dragging something invisible behind her, a weight that had not been there before she drank from the monk's bowl. She tried to convince herself it was exhaustion or a trick of the morning light, but when she stopped to rest and stood perfectly still in a patch of direct sunlight, her shadow continued to move for a fraction of a moment, settling into place like a dog sitting reluctantly at its master's command. Other pilgrims passed her on the trail, chatting and laughing, and Amara watched their shadows and saw that they moved in perfect synchronization with their bodies, no delay, no hesitation, and she understood that what was happening to her was not normal, not something that could be explained by fatigue or dehydration. She wanted to stop someone and ask if they saw it too, if her shadow looked strange, but she could not find the words, and the idea of voicing the observation felt dangerous, as though speaking it aloud would make it more real, more permanent. Back in Colombo, Amara tried to resume her normal life, but the shadow problem persisted and worsened. At first it was just the delay, the slight lag when she moved, but after a few days she began to notice that the shadow was not just slow, it was reluctant, as though it did not want to follow her at all. When she walked through her apartment, her shadow would hesitate before crossing doorways, as though checking the space first. And when she stood in front of mirrors, her reflection was normal, but her shadow would sometimes appear in positions that did not match her stance, tilted wrong or facing a different direction. Her students at school began to comment on it, not directly but through glances and whispers, children noticing things adults missed. And one of her brightest students, a girl named Rashmi, stayed after class one day and asked Amara quietly if she was feeling well, because her shadow looked sick. Amara asked what she meant, and Rashmi struggled to explain, saying only that the shadow looked tired and sad, like it wanted to rest but could not. Amara dismissed the observation as childish imagination, but it stayed with her, gnawing at her thoughts, and that night she stood in her bathroom under the bright fluorescent light and watched her shadow on the white tile floor, and she saw what Rashmi had seen. The shadow was wrong, not in shape, but in essence. It looked faded and thin, as though it were slowly dissolving, and when Amara moved her hand, the shadow's hand took a moment to respond, and the motion was not quite right, the fingers spreading too wide and the wrist bending at an angle that her own wrist had not bent. Amara began researching, spending hours online reading about shadows and their significance in various spiritual traditions, and she found references to the idea that shadows were not just absence of light, but representations of the soul, visible manifestations of the inner self projected into the physical world. In some Buddhist texts, the shadow was described as a karmic imprint, carrying the weight of past actions and future consequences. And in certain folk traditions, it was believed that the shadow could be separated from the body through curses or spiritual attacks, leaving the person vulnerable and incomplete. Amara found one account that seemed particularly relevant, a story from Sri Lanka about a monk who had lived on Adam's Peak centuries ago, a guardian of the sacred footprint who had devoted his life to helping pilgrims make the climb. According to the legend, the monk had died of exhaustion during a particularly harsh pilgrimage season, collapsing on the mountain after giving his own food and water to struggling climbers, and his spirit had remained on the peak, continuing his work in death as he had in life. But there was a dark aspect to the legend, a warning that those who accepted the monk's help too freely would find themselves bound to the mountain, their souls tethered to the stone, unable to move forward in their spiritual journey, because a piece of them remained behind, anchored to the place where they had received the blessing. Amara made the decision to return to Sripada, to climb the mountain again and find the monk, to demand that he release whatever hold he had on her. She did not tell anyone about her plan, did not mention the shadow or the monk or the growing sense that she was slowly losing herself, because she knew it would sound insane, the ramblings of someone experiencing a breakdown. She traveled to the base of the mountain on a weekday in the off-season, when the number of pilgrims was minimal, and she began the climb in late afternoon, planning to reach the summit after dark when the monk had appeared before. The ascent was grueling, her legs protesting and her lungs burning, and without the energy she had felt on her first climb, the journey seemed endless. She passed a few other pilgrims, mostly locals, making quiet, personal pilgrimages, and none of them paid her any attention, focused on their own spiritual quests. As darkness fell, Amara pulled out a flashlight and continued climbing, the beam cutting through the blackness and illuminating the worn stone steps ahead. She climbed for hours, her determination the only thing keeping her moving, and she was beginning to think the monk would not appear, that perhaps he only came during the busy pilgrimage season, when she saw a figure ahead on the trail, standing motionless in the shadows beyond her flashlight's reach. Amara approached slowly, her heart pounding, and as she drew closer, she recognized the monk, the same barefoot figure in simple robes, the same wooden bowl in his hands. He was standing exactly where he had been before, in the same spot on the trail, and he was offering the bowl to her just as he had the first time, and Amara felt a wave of anger and fear so intense it made her dizzy. She stopped a few meters away and refused the water, demanding to know what he had done to her, what he had taken when she drank from his bowl. The monk did not speak, did not react at all, and Amara realized with a start that he was not looking at her. His eyes were focused on something past her shoulder, and she turned to see what he was staring at, and saw her shadow on the trail behind her. And the shadow was not moving, it was standing still even though Amara was turning, and it was facing the monk as though it recognized him. Amara turned back to the monk and saw that he was holding out the bowl, not to her, but to the shadow, and she understood with cold horror that the shadow was the one he wanted, the piece of her soul that had stayed behind on the mountain, and that by drinking the water she had created a connection that allowed him to slowly pull the shadow back, to reclaim it for the mountain. She asked him why, her voice shaking, and this time the monk did speak, his voice soft and raspy, as though he had not used it in a very long time. He said that the mountain required guardians, souls to watch over it and protect it, and that those who climbed seeking spiritual renewal were offering themselves whether they knew it or not, and that the water he gave was a test, a choice made unconsciously, and those who drank were agreeing to leave a piece of themselves behind, to become part of the eternal vigil. Amara protested that she had not known, had not agreed, but the monk shook his head slowly and said that the soul knows, even when the mind does not, and that her shadow had accepted the bargain willingly, drawn to the peace and purpose that the mountain offered. He told her that she could leave now, return to her life, and that over time her shadow would fade completely, and her connection to the physical world would weaken until she became like him, a spirit bound to the mountain, or she could stay, embrace the transformation, and find the peace her father had sought in his annual pilgrimages. Amara felt tears streaming down her face because both options were unbearable, losing herself slowly in the world below or losing herself immediately by staying, and she did not know which fate was worse. She chose to leave, stumbling back down the mountain in a daze, her shadow trailing behind her like a reluctant child being dragged away from a playground. She reached the base as dawn broke, exhausted and hollow, and she returned to Colombo with the knowledge that she was living on borrowed time, that every day her shadow grew fainter and her sense of self grew weaker. She stopped teaching, unable to maintain the focus required, and she withdrew from her friends and family, not wanting them to see what she was becoming. She spent her days sitting in sunlight, trying to hold on to her shadow, trying to keep it present and solid, but it was like trying to hold water in her hands, and she could feel it slipping away. 6 months after her second climb, Amara returned to Sripada for the final time, no longer fighting the pull, no longer trying to resist. She climbed the mountain slowly, taking her time, and when she reached the summit, she did not turn back. The monk was there, waiting as he always did, and Amara's shadow finally separated completely, stepping away from her body and standing beside the monk, solid and at peace. And Amara felt herself becoming lighter, translucent, her physical form fading as her spiritual form integrated with the mountain. Pilgrims who climb Sri Pada at night still report encountering a monk offering water from a wooden bowl, and some accept and some refuse, and those who accept find themselves renewed and energized, able to complete the climb with ease, but they also find that their shadows begin to lag, to hesitate, to show reluctance, and over time they feel the pull to return, to climb the mountain again and again, until one day they do not come back down. The guardians of the mountain are many, spirits bound to the stone through their own choices, their own moments of acceptance, and they watch over the pilgrims with gentle sadness, knowing that each act of kindness perpetuates the cycle, that each offered bowl of water is another soul choosing to stay. Amara's family never learned what happened to her, only that she went to the mountain and did not return, and her body was never found because there was no body to find. Only another shadow joining the others in the eternal vigil, another soul given freely to the sacred peak. I hope you enjoyed these stories. Tomorrow we will be uploading another terrifying story. If you enjoyed these stories, feel free to subscribe and put on your notifications to never miss another scary video. And if you want to, there's a link to buy me a coffee in the description too. Thank you for listening and wish you all the best.